Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Omni viewer, and I actually wasn't expecting to make an addendum to my review of YUZO the Biggest Battle in Tokyo, but I did get a couple of comments on that video that got me thinking about stuff I didn't think about when writing the review, and having thought about them, I think they are worth addressing. So, first comment that kind of got the old brain juices flowing was how somebody said it seemed like this movie was kind of in a similar vein to the madcap comedy works of filmmaker Minoru Kawasaki, who has made various different movies, some of which have been imported to America, some of which haven't. And I found that to be a very interesting comparison because I love Minoru Kawasaki's work, that which I've seen of it anyway. I've specifically seen The Calamari Wrestler, Executive Koala, Monster X Strikes Back Attack the G8 Summit, and Monster Seafood Wars, which I have a review of on this channel. It was a Thanksgiving special. You should probably watch that to refresh yourself or to get the gist of what I think of that movie before we go any further, because I am going to be bringing it up again. Now, like I said, love those movies. I think Kawasaki is a comedic genius. So why do I like his movies, but I don't like YUZO? Are they really that similar? Well, didn't take me too long to figure out the answer. Let's focus on Monster Seafood Wars. Yes, it is a completely crazy, zany kaiju comedy. Absolutely ridiculous and absolutely hilarious. But as you watch it, you'll notice there's sort of a unifying concept, a single idea that weaves its way through practically everything you see in that movie. And that central idea is food. The movie is ultimately about food. Consider, the three monsters that show up in that movie are, respectively, a giant octopus, a giant squid, and a giant crab. Now, when they're normal-sized, those creatures would be considered edible in Japan because there are dishes you can make out of them, hence the title Monster Seafood Wars. A squid is viewed by the Japanese the same way a cow is viewed by Americans, although I don't know what the Japanese shout at a squid as they drive past it. When the monsters are wounded and chunks of their flesh fly off, people's mouths start to water because that has become meat. As mentioned, these creatures are usually edible. So the sight of giant chunks of meat makes the people in the movie hungry, and they decide to try it. It turns out these creatures are delicious, which leads to a montage in the middle of the movie, a fairly long one at that, of people from all across Japan trying out this kaiju meat and how it gradually becomes the latest culinary craze in the land of the rising sun. But how do you defeat a giant seafood monster? You design a cannon that shoots pressurized vinegar, and then you stick a giant robot chef on it. These are things that we would expect in tokusatsu, a new weapon and a giant robot, but they're given a culinary spin. The protagonist of the movie, the guy who accidentally led to these monsters existing in the first place, had created this new formula that was meant to make animals bigger, partly because when he was a kid he was a kaiju fan, and he still kind of is, but his ultimate goal was so that this formula could be used to make larger animals that would solve world hunger. A larger animal can produce more meat on its own than several smaller animals can. And that once again relates back to the idea of food and eating food. There are two important scenes involving the primary characters that take place at a restaurant. And what is a restaurant but a place where you go to be served food? One of the documentary-style scenes provides an epilogue towards the end of the movie, sort of telling us what happened afterward, that says they tried implementing the formula on livestock and it worked, but it also led to a bunch of giant mosquitoes rampaging across Japan because they didn't count on the mosquitoes biting the livestock and absorbing the formula and growing themselves. Why do mosquitoes bite? Because that's how they sustain themselves. It's how they eat. You see how it all ties together. This central idea of food and the eating thereof is what unifies everything we see in the movie. That means everything that happens, regardless of how crazy it might be, somehow relates back to that concept, or will somehow be tied into that concept at some point. So, It provides us with the right context. We understand this is a movie about food. Everything that happens in it has to do with food. So we understand why all of the humor works. But what about YUZO? What is YUZO's central idea? Well, at first it seems like it's going to be the pandemic and the lockdowns, because that's what it was billed as, right? This is the pandemic kaiju movie. You look at all the advertisements, all the press surrounding it. That's the main idea. And for the first little bit of it, that seems like what it's going to be about. But then that theme gets gradually forgotten and replaced with workplace shenanigans. And workplace shenanigans can be a unifying theme, but you gotta have something that ties even that together. Instead, what we get is stuff that's just completely random. The characters are all crazy in some way, eccentric, weird, but that alone is not enough. That's too vague of an idea, which is why all of the different characters, different eccentricities feel so random, because they are random. They just went with this vague idea of they're all weird and took each one in such extreme directions of weird that they don't feel like they belong in the same movie, let alone in the same building. So we can't really latch on to anything there other than YUZO being kind of bewildered by it all, but even then his bewilderment only seems to extend so far. Like, he's mildly uncomfortable. He doesn't seem to have that strong of a reaction unless it's in one of those musical sequences, which again, that feels out of left field because the movie's not technically a musical, yet we have these random musical numbers thrown in. So, was it supposed to be a musical? How can there be so few musical numbers in a musical? And by the end, when Virus King shows up, it seems like maybe we're back on track to this being about the pandemic somehow because of the name and the design. But unfortunately, as mentioned, Virus King's name doesn't actually mean anything. And yes, I know there are other kaiju with non-indicative names. This Ultra Monster is named Red King, but he doesn't have a single speck of red on him. Later versions, I think, did, but this is the original, and he is not red in any way, shape, or form. So he's also got a non-indicative name, but then again, just pointing out that his name doesn't match his color scheme is kind of a superficial detail. Virus King's name is a little bit different, because his name implies something a bit more active. Think about it. You can have just a regular old rat scurrying around, but what makes it a plague rat? It's a plague rat if it's carrying a virus into an area that will spread. That is the difference. The name implies something a bit more active. So Virus King implies he would be spreading a virus, similar to how a plague rat might spread a plague. But he doesn't have anything to do with it either. It's just a name that creates the illusion of a connection. In fact, the plot of the movie can really be described a lot with the phrase, "and then." YUZO loses his job during the lockdown, and then he goes to a musical bar, and then he gets a new job out of this crazy place, and then he gets circled around the different departments, and then he learns that the CEO is trying to catch a UFO, and then a monster shows up, and then. And I think you've probably heard this bit of writing advice before, but you want to try avoiding the phrase "and then" as much as possible with your plot progression. You want there to be cause and effect. You want there to be therefore, but then, and so, until, all these different things that can lead into each other that will actively create a flow and create progression. Not just random stuff happens, and then more random stuff happens. So there's nothing that unifies YUZO. It seems like there should be when you go in, but there isn't. So you could certainly glance at YUZO and Monster Seafood Wars and say, oh, they're both wacky movies with giant monsters in them, so they must be similar. But when you actually really look at them, they're as different as night and day. The other comment I read came from the perspective that this particular person related to the movie because he also, according to him, lost his job during the lockdowns and had to find employment elsewhere. And it was having his life completely turned upside down, just like what YUZO went through. So that must mean that my inability to connect to the movie is because I didn't live through that. Now, okay, I'll own up to that. Since stuff like this is what I do for a living, yeah, I didn't lose my primary source of income during the lockdowns. Okay, the lockdowns did not affect me in that particular manner. Of course, the lockdowns and the pandemic in general had far greater effects on the world and individual people, not all of which can be measured in monetary means. But this isn't a competition about who suffered more. My main point is that everybody was affected somehow. Some externally, some internally, some in all those ways. Some of it was more extreme than others, but everybody went through it and everybody was touched by it somehow. So, okay, I didn't lose my primary job during the pandemic, so I cannot relate to YUZO on that level because I don't have the personal experience. But wait a minute. I'm also a person who's never been a soldier or gone off to war. So why do I get so invested and relate to the characters in things like MASH or the Fighting 69th or Top Gun or all these other military stories if I don't have that experience? I also have no interest whatsoever in racing, and I have no knowledge in the field of auto mechanic engineering. But I'm on record stating that I think Ford versus Ferrari is a modern classic. This is strange now because I'm being told that what's preventing me from relating to the movie and really understanding it is the fact that I didn't live through what the main character's living through. But here are all these other works that are showing all these other things that I haven't lived through. And I love them. I really enjoy them. I get invested in them. I relate to the characters. Well, since when was having the lived experience a prerequisite for enjoying something, right? It hasn't been, and I don't think it should be. The job of any good storyteller is to get the audience invested in the story and have them feel the proper ways about the characters, whether they've had that experience or not. Some stories have completely outlandish experiences that nobody is ever going to have. Star Wars is 100% fantasy. Nobody is going to grow up on a desert planet on a moisture farm, have their aunt and uncle killed by an evil galactic empire, and then go off on an adventure with a space wizard and a couple of droids to save a princess. Not gonna happen. And yet, Star Wars is one of those stories that people get so invested in that it's practically a subculture unto itself. So, yeah, I didn't experience exactly what YUZO experienced, but so what? Is that really a shortcoming on my part, or is it a shortcoming on the movie's part for not making it relatable? I mean, frankly, I'm kind of surprised that the people who made this movie did live through the lockdowns, because it doesn't feel like it was made by someone who actually knew what it was about. How can you depict an event like that and not show a single person who's concerned about getting sick? Why do you think the world was locked down in the first place? It was supposed to be that whole 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I mean a month, I mean a year, I mean we don't know when we're gonna open again, but you'll just have to deal with it. Yeah, that was a frustration, but that's a whole other thing. I mean, if Japan was locked down, that was clearly a concern. I didn't base this on any other thing. There were other things happening in America during 2020, but, you know, those were American events. They don't affect Japan. But Japan still went through a certain thing that every other nation was going through. It responded in a similar way to most of those nations. And yet, when we watch the movie, by the end, it feels like everyone's forgotten that there's even a global emergency in the first place. You know, I feel like I've said everything I can say about YUZO at this point. I did just want to add this last little bit here because it did get me thinking, and I could have addressed those things had I thought of them on my own, but I didn't. I was prompted by other people in the comments, and you know what? I do like when that happens. Unfortunately, this prompting just made me even more disappointed with the movie because now I actually had a reason to compare it to another example of a crazy Japanese comedy, and I realized it doesn't measure up to that, and I realized why, and that got me thinking about this whole other thing about how even when you're doing screwball comedy, you've got to have some kind of a unifying idea. Think about some of the great comedy routines. Is the Who's on First routine just Abbott and Costello throwing around a bunch of random words? No. It is a very precisely structured conversation about baseball and naming conventions. That is the focus, and everything comes back to that. And that's why, to this day, it's considered one of the best comedy routines ever. If it had just been them throwing around random words and sound effects, we wouldn't remember it nearly as well. We might not even remember Abbott and Costello, because that would be a pretty clear sign they didn't actually care about their craft, when they clearly did. And of course, this idea about how you need the lived experience is something I've been thinking about for a while, and I guess this did provide me an opportunity to talk about it. And I really don't get that idea at all. It's always seemed like a ridiculous idea to me. The only way you can truly understand it is if you've lived through it. The only way you can actually write about it is if you've lived through it. The entire history of storytelling says otherwise. So I guess it was rather fortuitous that I got the opportunity to kind of address it here, at least in one context. But ultimately, I think that's it. I think I've said everything I can say about YUZO at this point. So let's leave it in the past and move on to something else. What will it be? You'll find out soon enough. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.